You don't know squat about the squat, but today I'm going to show you. You know, squats seem really important. It says right here in this book, there is simply no other exercise and certainly no machine that produces the level of coordination, skeletal loading and bone density enhancement, musculoskeletal demand and toughness, and overall systemic conditioning than everyone who lifts weight should learn to squat correctly. Hey guys, Coach Michael here again. Another beautiful day at Starting Strength Boston, and today we're going to be talking about this lift right here, the squat. So as we know, the squat is pretty complicated. There's quite a lot that goes into it. If you've read this blue book and done your homework, Starting Strength Basic Barbell Training 3rd edition by Mark Ripito, you'll know that there are like 100 or maybe like 10,000 pages in the squat chapter, which makes it seem like it must be pretty important and kind of complicated. So I'm going to try to explain the squat today as simply as possible by breaking it down into a couple main components. All right, so let's talk about the type of squat that we're trying to do if we're trying to build the most amount of strength. We're going to use the low bar squat. So we're going to set the bar below the spine of the scapula, which, like I said in my first video, allows us to use the most amount of muscle and lift the most amount of weight. So if our goal is strength, that's a good thing right there. All right? And then this other criteria, full depth, that's going to give us the longest effective range of motion, and it's actually going to be a lot safer on the knees and other parts of the body and give us really the full benefit of this squat. Like I mentioned, the principle of specificity, the range of motion, if you don't train a range of motion, it's not going to get stronger. So you got to squat all the way down, sit on down there, don't be scared. Come on down like the price is right, hit that full depth, and you're going to get the maximum benefit out of your squat. So let's talk about how the heck all of this works, starting with the anatomy involved in the squat. All right, so we've established that squatting is really good for you, and you should definitely do it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the parts of the body that we're strengthening during the squat. So this is why it's good for you. This is all about the anatomy. We're going full Miss Frizzle, Magic School Bus right here. A lot of joints and segments involved. So if you watched my forces video, right, we know that we have some moment arms at play that we're going to get into in the mechanical side of this model, but that plays into this as well. So we have the joints and segments under load. The really important ones are the hip joint, the knee joint, and the back angle, and then I'm going to talk about the hamstrings a bit at the end. So let's start with these joints here, all right? So the joints under load in the squat involve the hip joint and the knee joint. The hip joint, we know, has some big old muscles and quite a few of them crossing over it. To name a few, we got the glutes, we got the hamstrings, we have the adductors, right? That's all important. The knee joint, we primarily have the quads performing knee extension. The hamstrings also cross the knee joint, and then the gastrocs of the calf muscles also cross the knee joint and play a very small role. And then the back is under load quite heavily in the squat. So like I said, we're doing a low bar squat, and in the low bar squat, we're assuming a very leaned over position at the bottom. And this leaned over position allows us to use all the musculature of the back to transfer force up our spine into the bar. So all the force generated by the hips and the knees here is getting transferred up there. So your back is getting strong in the process as well, and also contributing to the movement. And then the second part of this is the stance, right? So the stance that we're taking in the squat is more or less shoulder width, depending on the person. Your toes are going to be pointed out, which is a significant part of the squat, right? So by pointing your toes out, it facilitates a couple things. One, you're able to hit depth more easily, right? Because if your knees are just tracking forward, especially if you're more heavy set in the midsection, you're going to get all bunched up. Or especially if you have like bigger legs, then you can't hit depth as effectively. Your knees have to travel like super far forward. So by pointing the toes out, we're allowing ourselves to hit depth a lot more easily. And that's reason number one. Now, reason number two, anatomical relation here. The stretch reflex. So the adductors, the muscles of the inner thigh, them juicy little bad boys down there, they stretch out on the way down, as does the rest of your hip musculature as well. And then they contract sharply on the way up out of the bottom. So like if you ever watch a really grindy squat, you'll see someone kind of going down to the bottom, right? And then they pop right up for the first few inches kind of quickly, and then they kind of like hit a hard stall and then grind through that. And so that's the stretch reflex in action. So the way that works is there's elastic energy and kinetic energy at play, but there's also a little reflex in the nervous system. You got these little bad boys in your muscle cells called, I believe they're in the muscle cells, but they're in the muscles. They're called spindles. You got these little bad boys in your muscles called spindles. And what happens is they sense your muscle stretching rapidly, right? And then what they do is they kind of say to themselves like, uh-oh, the muscle is going to rip and tear off the bone. And so what they do is they contract and they shorten very quickly, which drives you right up out of the bottom for a very brief period of time. So that's more or less the stretch reflex. So it's important that you descend quickly enough in the spot. It's important that you descend quickly enough in the squat to activate the stretch reflex to trick your body into thinking that you're going to tear your muscles. And then the last piece of that is the hamstrings, like I said I was going to talk about. So the hamstrings are contracting. They're contracting isometrically on the way down, which means that they're staying the same length. And so what that does is it does a couple things. It pulls posteriorly backwards on the knee joint, right? So if this is my knee right here, my quads are pulling on the front side of it, the anterior side, around this whole tibial tuberosity down here, right? And then the hamstrings are pulling posteriorly on this side. So there's a balance of forces. You're pulling both forward and back on the knee so that your knee doesn't like just collapse and fall apart. So if you only do a half squat, right? That's a terrible like tendon origination point, but you know, picture it as that. In the quarter squat that we got right here, right? We got a lot of tension on the front side, the anterior side of the knee, but not so much on this side because the hamstrings are slack, which we don't want. So there's no tension on the back side of the knee. So you're putting the front side at an increased risk of getting hurt. And then also, if you're quarter squatting, you're loading up more weight than you can actually squat to depth. So that is also just putting like an increased unnecessary load on the front side of the knee, which is already bearing more of the load to begin with. So not good. So now that we've established that, and that's why we're low bar squatting, let's talk about the high bar and the front squat. We'll sort of compare and contrast. So we'll go to the front squat first, actually. So if the low bar squat is one end of the spectrum, the front squat is the other end of that spectrum, right? So the low bar squat, we're heavily loading the hip joint, and then in the front squat, we're heavily loading the knee joint. So what that does is it facilitates a more upright back angle. So like I said, in the low bar squat, we're training all the back using those muscles. The front squat, not quite as much. So you're still like using them to a small degree, but it's a much smaller degree. You're still extending the hip in the front squat, right? But you're doing it to a much smaller degree, and that's where our bigger muscles are. And then you're really sending the knees through a long range of motion. So you're putting a lot of emphasis on the knee joint, which has smaller muscles, which means you cannot lift as much weight in the front squat. And so therefore it is less efficient for building general strength. So if you're gonna pick up and not low bar squat, you may as well just full send and do a front squat, you know. None of this half in, half out garbage. Just throw out the high bar squats, all right? So if you're a novice, you're looking to get as strong as possible, as quickly as possible, all you need to concern yourself with is the low bar squat. And then even if you're an intermediate or an advanced lifter, that should still be, for 99% of people, that should be the core of your squat programming and training. All right, now let's talk about mechanics, and I'm not talking the Megadeth version of the smash hit, the Four Horsemen. I'm talking about mechanics of the squat. Two main things we're going to talk about here. There's the midfoot mechanics, incredibly important, the master cue as it's referred to in this blue book. And then I'm also going to talk about the joints and segments and the moment arms, like we kind of touched on in the anatomy section. So the bar has to travel over the midfoot for it to be the most efficient type of squat that we can do. And I talked about this in my forces video. You can introduce an unnecessary moment arm if the bar is not over midfoot. So that is like priority number one, bar needs to be over midfoot, right? And then as a result of having the bar over midfoot, everything else kind of falls into place around that. So like I talked about before, we want to use the big muscles of the hip. We want to train the back, right? We want to put less stress on the knee. So in order to do that, the bar placement is crucial. So placing the bar low on the back, below the spine of the scapula, is going to allow us to squat the way that we should be doing it. So in order to keep the bar over the middle of the foot in this type of squat, what you got to do is shove your butt back and lean over, and then the bar is going to travel in this nice, lovely straight line. And then, like I said before, that is training the muscles that we want to train. So by squatting in this fashion, this introduces a little bit of physics. We got different moment arms at play, right? So what happens essentially is the force of gravity pushing down on the bar gets multiplied along our segments into our joints. And so we have a longer moment arm, as you can see on the hip joint, right? The distance from where the bar is to the hip joint versus the distance from the bar to the knee joint. So we got a bigger moment arm in the hip joint than the knee joint, which means that more force is going into the hip joint, which has bigger muscles that are more well equipped to resist that force. So that's why we do it that way, right? So you got that bad boy right there. The force is being multiplied along the back. So you have all those big muscles in the back, and then you just have a tinier moment arm on the knee, which has tinier muscles. So it's like a little baby moment arm for the little baby muscles. So they're well equipped to handle that. So like we did a moment ago, we can look at the different types of squat and see how these mechanics change throughout those. So the same anatomical things still apply, and then mechanically, the front squat has a bigger moment arm on the knee, right, and a smaller one on the hip, relative to the low bar squat, and then the high bar squat is going to be somewhere between those two. And for the same reasons as I listed in the anatomy section, we're going to be able to lift more weight because we are placing the moment force on the larger joint that is more well equipped to handle the increased moment force. All right, so that's the Cliff Notes version of the low bar squat and why we do it. And just to recap a little bit, these are the three different primary types of squats listed in terms of how much weight you can lift, right? So the low bar squat, you can lift the most amount of weight because of the reasons that I laid out in this video. High bar squat's number 2, front squat is number 3. So from person to person, each person, like if I'm speaking directly to you, right? You can low bar squat the most amount of weight. You can low bar more than you can high bar, and you can high bar more than you can front squat, right? And you see some exceptions sometime, and that's either because the person has like an injury or they just don't know how to low bar squat, because a lot of people don't. So like, don't come at me with like, oh, John Hack, he squats more high bar than he does low bar, right? He falls into probably one of those two categories. But yeah, this is the general gist of the squat, and then I can get more specific and go into more detail in future videos. So if you guys would like to see more about the squat, leave a comment down below, say something down there. But yeah, that's it. Have a great day, pal.